Let your shoulders fall away from your ears now, wherever you are lying. Let your jaw loosen. Let your hands go soft and unclenched, palms open the way a child's hands open in sleep, before the world has taught them to hold on to anything at all. Tonight, we go back a long way. We go back before the Iron Throne meant anything to the woman we're about to sit with. We go back to a girl of perhaps 8 years, golden-haired, already aware of her own reflection in a way most children are not, walking through a wood with a friend and a boy who would grow up to be someone else entirely. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Only listen and let the accounts settle over you like dust settling over a room no one has entered in a very long time. The wood outside Casterly Rock in that particular telling of her childhood is not remarkable. Scrub oak, red clay underfoot, the kind of low western hills that hoard heat during the day and release it slowly at dusk, so that the air by evening carries a used warmth, like a hearthstone hours after the fire has gone out. The girl and her companions had heard of a woods witch living nearby, an old woman with green eyes and a hunched back, who was said to be able to answer any question a person dared to ask her. Children dare each other into these things the way children always have, treating fear as a game with rules, and so 3 of them went, half laughing, half afraid, the way you might approach a door you're not sure you want opened. The woman's hut, in most versions of the account, smelled of curdled milk and older things beneath that, unnamed roots boiling in a pot, the sourness of a house that has not been aired out. She kept animals inside with her, comfortable in the dark, hens roosting on the furniture as though the walls themselves belonged to them more than to her. This is worth sitting inside for a moment. The smell of it, the closeness. A child raised in a castle with servants for every task, accustomed to stone corridors and polished floors, stepping into a room that smelled of animal and root and rot. Fear, in a child, often arrives first through the nose, before the mind has caught up to understand why the body wants to leave. The girl was proud even then, we're told, certain of her own specialness in a way that had never once been tested, because nothing had ever needed to test it. She'd been born into wealth beyond most kingdoms, twin to a boy whose face mirrored her own so precisely that strangers sometimes could not tell them apart, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a child who's been told, in 100 small ways, that she is exceptional. She had likely gone into that hut expecting confirmation. Children who ask fortune-tellers questions are rarely looking for information. They are looking for someone else to say aloud the thing they already believe about themselves. What the woman told her instead, according to the account passed down through the years and repeated in whispered form long after it should have been forgotten, was this: that she would wed the prince, not the king, and that another woman, younger and more beautiful, would take from her everything she loved. That she would have 3 children, gold-haired like herself, and that all 3 would wear golden crowns, and all 3 would also meet their end in gold. The wording so precise and so strange that it lodged itself in memory, rather than being dismissed as the babble of an old woman playing at mysticism. And then, last, that a younger and more beautiful queen would come to cast her down and take all that she held dear. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment rather than hurrying past it, because so much of what follows in this life we're examining tonight can be traced back to a handful of sentences spoken inside a smoke-dark hut, to a child who had not yet done anything to deserve either the promise or the curse embedded in them. Consider what it does to a mind being handed a prophecy at 8 years old. Consider carrying a sentence like that through every year that follows, testing it against every disappointment, every rival, every reflection in still water that shows a face slightly less smooth than it once was. A prophecy given to a child does not simply predict a future. It builds a house inside the mind, and the mind spends the rest of its life either trying to burn that house down or trying to live inside it more comfortably than the fear allows. The girl left the hut that day changed in a way none of her companions were, because the words had been spoken directly to her, shaped around her name and her face and her particular fears, before she had even fully articulated them to herself. She did not tell her father. She did not, for many years, tell anyone at all, holding the words the way a person holds a stone in a pocket, forgetting it is there until the weight of it shifts against the leg, and the hand goes automatically to check that it has not been lost. A child who is told she will lose everything she loves does not become careless with love. She becomes a custodian of it, anxious and possessive, guarding what she has as though guarding could ever be a substitute for keeping. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to children who are handed knowledge before they have the tools to carry it, and this was one of those griefs, quiet and internal, and entirely without witnesses. No one comforted her, because no one knew there was anything to comfort. She simply returned to the rock that evening, ate her supper at the same table as always, was tucked into the same bed by the same nursemaids, and somewhere behind her eyes a second life had already begun running alongside the first, a shadow future laid over the ordinary one, whispering that none of this, the castle, the gold, the beauty, the favour, would be allowed to last. We should think too about the specific cruelty embedded in the shape of the prophecy itself, because it was not merely that she would lose things, it was that another woman, younger and more beautiful, would be the instrument of the loss. A child already primed by the world around her to measure her worth in mirrors and in the attention of men was handed a prophecy that made beauty itself the battlefield on which her future would be decided, that made every young woman who entered a room after her a potential thief of everything she had. It is difficult to imagine a curse better designed to make jealousy feel like foresight rather than flaw, to make suspicion feel like wisdom rather than wound. Consider too that the prophecy promised her a crown, and in that promise there was a strange comfort folded inside the horror, because it told her that despite everything that would be taken, she would first be given the very thing she wanted most. She would sit where queens sit. She would wear what queens wear. The tragedy, as it would unfold across the decades that followed, was that even the granting of the wish would arrive wrapped in disappointment. A crown placed on her head not by choice but by circumstance, married not to the golden prince of her childhood imagining but to a man who would never once look at her, the way she had imagined being looked at. There is something in this account, if we let ourselves sit with it long enough, that resembles every family's private mythology, the story a household tells about a child before that child has had any real chance to become herself. Perhaps you were told as a child that you were the clever one or the difficult one, or the one who would break hearts, or the one who would never settle. Words like that, spoken early and repeated often enough, or spoken only once but with enough weight behind them, have a way of writing themselves into the architecture of a life whether we consent to it or not. The girl in the wood outside Casterly Rock was handed a story about herself before she had lived enough to write her own, and she spent the rest of her existence, by every account that survives her, trying to outrun a sentence she never should have been given to carry. Let your breathing slow now, in and out, unhurried, and let us drift a little further forward in time, to where this girl becomes a woman we recognise by another name, a name spoken with fear and pity in equal measure across the story that made her famous. Jon Snow, generations removed from any of this, standing at the edge of a battlefield he did not choose, would never once hear the name Maggy the Frog, Daenerys Targaryen, flying above cities she meant to save, would never know that the woman she would eventually face across a throne room had been handed her own doom as a child in a hut that smelled of curdled milk. And yet the prophecy moves through the story like water through soil, unseen but shaping everything that grows above it, because every choice this woman would go on to make, every alliance broken, every rival destroyed before that rival could destroy her first, traces its root back to a sentence spoken to a child who wanted only to be told she was special. We often imagine that the great and terrible figures of history and legend are born already formed, already hardened, as if cruelty were simply a temperature some people are born burning at. But it is worth sitting with the alternative, that cruelty is very often manufactured slowly, out of fear repeated so many times that it calcifies into something that looks, from the outside, like coldness, but which began, underneath all of it, as a child standing in a doorway she should never have walked through, hearing words she was too young to carry and carrying them anyway because there was no one to take the weight from her. The wood outside Casterly Rock is long gone now. In the telling, grown over or forgotten, the hut collapsed, the old woman dead and dust for centuries. But the sentence she spoke did not need a wood or a hut to survive. It needed only a child willing to believe it, and children are, almost without exception, willing to believe the things said about them, especially the frightening things, because fear teaches faster and more permanently than comfort ever does. And so the prophecy outlived its speaker by decades, quietly steering a life from behind the scenes, the way underground water steers the growth of trees above it, invisible, patient, and utterly indifferent to whether the tree ever notices the source of what shapes it. Rest now in that thought, if you can. Not every beginning announces itself. Some begin in silence, in a single afternoon that seemed at the time like nothing more than a child's dare in the woods, and only later, looking backward across the whole shape of a life, do we understand that this was where it started. This was the room the whole house was built around. You do not need to remember the details. You do not need to hold on to the names or the dates. Let them settle instead, soft as ash, and let your own thoughts go quiet the way the wood outside the rock must have gone quiet after the children left it. Birds resuming their calls, evening settling back over the hills as though nothing at all had happened there, though everything in fact just had. The story will keep. It has kept for a very long time already, passed from mouth to mouth, page to page, patient in the way that only old stories are patient, content to wait for whoever needs to hear it next. Let your mind loosen its grip on the wood, on the hut, on the frightened child at its centre. There is more to come, more rooms in this house we're walking through together, but none of it needs to be held right now. Only received gently, the way you might receive a hand offered in the dark, and then let go of, as sleep finally arrives to take you the rest of the way. You can let your eyes stay closed now, if they have not already fallen closed on their own. There is no need to track anything, no need to hold a single fact upright in your mind as though it might fall and shatter. We are still inside Casterly Rock, still inside a childhood, but we're widening the frame a little now, to include the boy who shared a womb with the girl from the wood, because it is impossible to speak honestly of what she wanted without speaking of him first. The one person in her life who was never a stranger, never a suitor to be won, never a rival to be feared, only ever from the very first hour, an extension of herself that happened to walk around in a separate body. Twins born to the same mother within moments of each other carry a particular kind of intimacy that the rest of us can only guess at from the outside, a closeness built not through years of shared experience, but present from the very first breath, before either of them had done anything to earn it or lose it. In the account of this family, the boy and girl were said to be so alike in feature that even those who had known them from birth sometimes needed a moment to tell them apart, and there is something almost unbearably tender in that detail if you let yourself sit with it. Two faces so identical that the difference between them existed only in the smallest of margins, a slight cant of the eyes, the fall of a shadow, nothing more. Consider what it might do to a child's understanding of love, to grow up beside a mirror that speaks, that laughs, that runs through the same halls at the same pace, and reaches for the same fruit off the same low branch. Where other children learn early that love is something offered by people fundamentally different from themselves, parents who are larger and stranger, siblings who are older or younger and therefore other, this girl learned love first from someone who looked at her and effectively saw himself. It is a rare kind of beginning, and it teaches a rare kind of lesson, one that would follow her through every relationship that came after, the quiet, unexamined belief that true intimacy requires sameness, that being loved and being mirrored are in fact the very same thing. Their father ruled from the rock with a hand famous for its coldness, a man whose reputation for discipline and control extended well beyond the borders of his own household into the histories of entire kingdoms, and it is worth resting for a moment on what it means to grow up as the daughter of such a man. She adored him, by every surviving account, watched him the way a plant turns toward light, absorbing his lessons about strength and legacy and the particular danger of ever appearing weak in front of people who might use that weakness against you. And yet for all her devotion, she understood from an early age that the inheritance he was building, the great house, the gold mines, the name that would echo through centuries, was an inheritance being prepared for her brother, not for her, regardless of how much sharper her instincts for power might prove to be than his. This is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. A girl raised beside her exact double, equally capable, equally intelligent, arguably more attuned to strategy and consequence than the brother she was born beside, watching the entire architecture of her family's future being constructed around his name, simply because of an accident of anatomy neither of them had chosen. There is a particular grief in watching a mirror receive opportunities denied to you for no reason except the shape of a body, and it is a grief that does not announce itself loudly. It settles instead, quietly, into the foundation of a person, becoming something closer to a permanent tilt in the floor than a single sharp injury, something you learn to walk around rather than something you ever fully healed from. The two of them, brother and sister, grew into something that resisted easy naming even by the standards of their own world, an attachment so total that it eventually crossed lines most societies consider unbreakable, and it would be easy, from a great distance and with the comfort of hindsight, to speak of this only in terms of scandal. But scandal is a word that belongs to observers, not to the people living inside a bond, and it is worth considering gently, without excusing anything that followed from it, what it might mean to be raised in isolation from equals, surrounded by servants who could never be true companions, and a father who measured affection in terms of usefulness, and to find, in that isolation, exactly one person who required nothing of you except your presence. Their brother, unlike her, was permitted the sword, the horse, the training yard, all the visible instruments of the power their father wielded, while she was given instead the loom, the needle, the careful education in running a household that would one day belong, in the eyes of the world, to someone else's name. It is difficult to imagine a more efficient design for resentment than handing one twin every tool of agency and the other twin none, while insisting all the while that both were equally loved. Love, offered unequally, does not stop being love, but it does become something a little harder to trust, something a person learns to test rather than simply receive. We should pause here and consider the shape of a particular ambition that was beginning, even in these early years, to take root in her, an ambition without any legitimate outlet, because every avenue toward real power in the world she had been born into required either a husband willing to share it, or a son willing to wield it on her behalf. She could not train as a knight. She could not inherit the rock in her own name while a brother lived who could inherit it instead. Every door that led toward the kind of authority she watched her father exercise so effortlessly was a door built for someone else's hand, and she stood before those doors again and again throughout her childhood, understanding perfectly well what lay behind them, and understanding just as well that she would never be permitted to open them herself. There is a version of this story, and it may well be the truest version, in which her later hunger for the Iron Throne was never really about the throne at all, not in the way it might have been for someone born a man, someone for whom the throne represented simply the next rung on an expected ladder. For her, the throne represented something closer to proof, evidence that could be pointed to, undeniable and public, that she had been exactly as capable as the brother she mirrored, that the accident of her body had not been the disqualifying fact everyone around her treated it as. Every later ambition, every calculated cruelty, every refusal to yield an inch of power once she finally held any at all, can be traced back to this early and entirely reasonable fury at being told over and over in 1,000 small ways that her twin's face on her own shoulders would have opened every door that her actual shoulders kept closed. It is worth remembering too that twins raised this closely often develop a private language of glances and silences that outsiders can never fully access, and this pair was no exception, communicating across crowded halls with looks that carried entire conversations, protecting one another instinctively in ways that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a bond formed before either of them had any concept of strategy at all. Whatever judgment history has cast on what that bond eventually became, it is worth sitting, just for a moment, with the tenderness that existed underneath it in the beginning. Two children finding in each other the one relationship in an otherwise cold household that asked nothing and gave everything. And yet even this, even the one unconditional love of her early life, would eventually be reshaped by the same forces that reshaped everything else she wanted, because a boy raised to wield swords does not remain a boy forever, and a life of service to a kingdom's protection would eventually pull her mirror away from her, into an order that demanded he give up titles, lands, even the right to father children of his own, choosing a white cloak over the future their father had intended for him. When he made that choice, she experienced it by every account, not merely as the loss of a brother's company, but as a kind of second betrayal by fate itself, another door closing on a version of her future that had briefly, foolishly seemed secure. Let us drift forward now, gently, toward the shape this bond would eventually take in the wider story the world came to know. Jaime Lannister, the Golden Knight the realm would come to both admire and revile, carried inside him for the whole of his life the imprint of this same early closeness, a loyalty to his sister that would outlast reason, outlast honour, outlast even his own attempts late in his life to become someone different from the boy their father shaped him into. Every choice he made in service of her, every lie he told on her behalf, every crime he quietly absorbed rather than exposed, traces back to this same wood outside the rock, this same nursery, this same mirror neither of them ever fully learned to live apart from. There is something achingly human in all of this, if you let yourself sit inside it, rather than judging it from a comfortable distance. Two children, denied the ordinary comforts of a warm household, built their own small country of two, with its own rules and its own loyalties, and spent the rest of their lives paying the price for a closeness that the wider world was never built to accommodate. It is worth asking gently, without excusing what followed, how many of us might have built something similar, given the same isolation, the same cold father, the same absence of anyone else willing to simply be present without condition. Let your breathing find its slow rhythm again now, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the pace of someone who has already decided somewhere beneath conscious thought that sleep is closer than it was a few minutes ago. We have walked through the wood and through the nursery both tonight, through prophecy and through the particular loneliness of being loved unequally, and none of it needs to stay gripped in your hands. Let it settle instead, the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water, patient, unbothered, simply becoming part of the ground beneath whatever comes next. The mirror is still whole in this part of the story. It has not yet been cracked by everything still to come, the marriages, the wars, the fires. For now, in this room we are leaving behind as we drift toward the next, there are only two children in a cold castle, looking at each other and finding, in that single reflection, the only proof either of them needed that they were not in fact entirely alone in the world. Rest in that, if only for a moment, before we move on. It is worth lingering too on the particular architecture of Casterly Rock itself during these years. A fortress carved directly into a mountain of stone rather than built upon open ground, its halls cool even in summer, its deepest chambers said to hold a chill that no fire ever fully drove out. Children raised inside stone like that learn a particular relationship with sound. The way voices carry oddly down long corridors, the way footsteps announce themselves minutes before a person actually arrives, and it is worth imagining the twins moving through those halls together, two sets of footsteps so alike in rhythm that servants sometimes could not tell, from sound alone, which child was approaching. There is a tenderness, too, in imagining the ordinary moments that must have filled the years between the more dramatic turns of this account. Quiet afternoons spent side by side rather than in crisis. A shared joke understood by no one else in the household. A private signal passed between them across a crowded hall during some tedious formal occasion neither of them wanted to attend. These moments rarely survive in the histories, which tend to remember only the crises and the scandals, but it is worth sitting with the likelihood that most of the actual texture of this bond was built from exactly this kind of unremarkable closeness, ordinary, repeated, and entirely without witnesses who thought to write it down. Consider, too, the particular weight their father's ambitions placed on both children equally, even as opportunity was distributed so unequally between them. A man who expected greatness from both his heirs, regardless of which one the wider world would permit to actually wield it. This created its own strange symmetry. Both twins carrying the same impossible expectation, one permitted the tools to attempt fulfilling it, and one denied those same tools entirely, and it is worth sitting with how this shared pressure, even unequally applied, may have deepened rather than strained the bond between them. Two people equally burdened by a father's exacting vision, even if only one of them was ever handed the sword to try meeting it. It is worth sitting, finally, with the particular way this bond would be remembered by those who witnessed it from the outside across the years that followed, never fully understood, often whispered about, always slightly apart from the ordinary categories the wider world used to make sense of family and loyalty. There is a loneliness in being misunderstood even in your closest relationship, known intimately by exactly one other person while remaining to everyone else. A puzzle they could only guess at from the outside, and it is worth pausing on how thoroughly this shaped her expectation for the rest of her life, that true understanding would always remain rare, private, and impossible to expect from anyone beyond the smallest imaginable circle. Let the weight of the day lift now, if any of it is still sitting on you. We are moving forward several years in this account, to a girl grown into something closer to a young woman, old enough now to understand that the prophecy she carried in secret had named a prince as her destined husband, and old enough too to have already decided which prince she meant for that word to describe. There is nothing urgent in what follows, only a disappointment, quiet and formative, the kind that rearranges a person from the inside without ever announcing itself as anything more than an afternoon's bad news. By the time she'd reached an age where marriage negotiations became a live and pressing subject rather than an abstraction, there was one prince in the Seven Kingdoms whose name outshone every other, a young man of a dragon line so old and so mythologized that his very existence seemed to belong to legend rather than to the ordinary business of court alliances. Silver-haired, violet-eyed, said to play a harp with a melancholy so total that grown men wept without understanding why, he represented, for a girl raised on stories of beauty and destiny, something closer to a promise fulfilled than a mere political match. She had never met him. It did not matter. Longing rarely requires the inconvenience of an actual encounter. Her father, ever the strategist, arranged for her to be presented to the reigning king's court, hoping to secure exactly the match his daughter had already begun dreaming of on her own, a joining of the wealthiest house in the realm with the oldest and most storied. It is worth sitting for a moment inside the particular vulnerability of that moment. A young woman groomed her entire life for consequence, dressed in her family's finest, brought before a mad and paranoid king specifically to be looked at, to be assessed, to be either chosen or discarded based on criteria she had no power to influence and very little ability to even understand from the outside. The king who ruled in that era was a man whose fear of the Lannisters had curdled over years into something closer to obsession, a suspicion that the wealth and ambition of Casterly Rock represented a threat to his own line rather than a resource to strengthen it. Whatever hopes her father carried into that court arrangement, Whatever careful words were exchanged in private chambers about dowries and alliances and the mutual benefit of joining two great houses, they broke apart against the particular paranoia of a king who had convinced himself that no Lannister daughter would ever wear a crown while he still drew breath. The betrothal, before it had even properly begun, was refused. It is worth pausing on the specific cruelty of a refusal that never fully explains itself, because that is what she was left with, not a rejection she could argue against or a flaw she might have corrected, but simply the closed door of another person's fear, arbitrary and total, and utterly beyond her influence. She had done nothing wrong. She had, in fact, done everything expected of her, presented herself with grace, embodied every quality a great house could want in a future queen, and still the answer had been no, delivered not even to her directly, but through the careful, humiliating channels of court diplomacy, so that she learned of her own rejection the way one learns gossip, second-hand, filtered through other people's mouths. We should sit with this for a moment rather than hurrying past it. The particular helplessness of being judged and found wanting for reasons that have nothing at all to do with your own qualities, so much of what would define this woman's later life. The compulsive need to control outcomes rather than trust in the goodwill of others, the deep suspicion of promises made by powerful men, the conviction that safety exists only where power is directly held rather than politely requested, finds one of its earliest roots here, in a rejection delivered not because she had failed at anything, but because a frightened king's private fears had nothing whatsoever to do with her. The prince himself, by most accounts, never even knew how close the arrangement had come to happening, going on instead to marry a foreign princess in a match arranged for reasons of dynastic tidiness rather than affection, and years later to fall into a love so consuming and so catastrophic that it would help ignite a war spanning the entire continent. It is a strange thing to spend one's youth quietly convinced that a particular man is one's destined match, only to watch that same man's actual choices unfold from a distance, entirely indifferent to a betrothal that existed, in truth, only inside negotiations she was never even permitted to witness. There is a version of grief reserved specifically for futures that never happened, and it is in some ways a lonelier grief than the ordinary kind, because there is no funeral for it, no ritual, no socially sanctioned period of mourning. No one else in the story particularly noticed or cared that a 15-year-old girl had quietly built an entire imagined life around a man she'd never met, and so, when that imagined life dissolved, she was left to grieve it alone, privately, without permission to even call it a loss in front of anyone who might ask why. She seemed distant in the weeks that followed. It is worth considering too what this refusal taught her about the nature of power itself, a lesson that would calcify over the following years into something like doctrine. She had watched her father, a man whose wealth genuinely exceeded that of kings, be turned away not through any failure of strategy or diplomacy, but through the simple, unaccountable whim of a man who happened to sit on a chair made of melted swords. Wealth, she learned that year, was not the same as power. Beauty, she learned that year, was not the same as power. The only thing that had ever actually mattered in the final accounting was the ability to say no and have that no be final, an ability that belonged, in the world she had been born into, almost exclusively to men who already held thrones. We should consider, gently, what it might do to a young woman's sense of her own worth to be so thoroughly assessed and so completely rejected before she had even been given the chance to speak for herself in the matter. There is a particular kind of quiet fury that grows in people who are treated as objects to be evaluated rather than as agents capable of choosing their own fate, and it rarely announces itself immediately. It settles instead, the way frost settles on a window overnight, invisible until the morning light catches it and reveals the whole pattern all at once, delicate and cold and entirely uninvited. It bears mentioning too the particular irony that would only become visible many years later, when the child eventually born to the very union she had once dreamed of, half dragon and half foreign blood, would grow into the very woman prophesied to strip her of everything she loved, though neither of them, in that distant year of the refused betrothal, could have possibly known how the threads of their lives would eventually cross. The younger and more beautiful queen of the old prophecy was, in this telling, still an unborn possibility at the very moment this rejection took place, waiting somewhere in the future to become real. Let us sit with that pattern for a moment, the way one refusal in girlhood seeded an entire later war without either party understanding the connection at the time. History rarely announces its own ironies as they happen. It waits, patient as stone, until decades have passed and every player involved has either died or grown old enough to see the whole shape of the thing at once. The girl who was refused a prince could not have known she was also, in some small way, being spared a marriage into the very bloodline that would one day come to burn down everything she eventually built in its place. Instead, in the immediate aftermath of the refusal, her father began looking elsewhere, toward another royal house entirely, one led by a stag rather than a dragon, a rebellion brewing on the horizon that would soon reshape the entire map of allegiances across the continent. She did not yet know that the crown she still believed was owed to her would eventually arrive by an entirely different and far less romantic road, delivered not through the silver-haired prince of her girlhood, imagining, but through a war she had no part in starting and a husband she had not yet even met. Consider, if you will, how much of what follows in this account is shaped by that early lesson in disappointment. The discovery that even a Lannister, even the most eligible daughter in the wealthiest house in the realm, could be dismissed as easily as a servant sent from a room. Every later refusal to be dismissed again, every insistence on holding power in her own hands rather than trusting it to the goodwill of men who might change their minds without warning, traces its origin back to this quiet, unremarked-upon afternoon of rejection, a wound that never scarred over so much as it hardened into policy. Let your breathing slow again now, unhurried, patient, the way a tide slows as it reaches the furthest edge of the shore before beginning its long retreat. We have sat tonight with prophecy, with the mirror of a twin, and now, with the particular grief of a future imagined and then refused. None of it needs to be carried forward into wherever your thoughts go from here. Let the prince fade back into legend. Let the refused betrothal settle into the quiet architecture of what came before, and let yourself rest, simply rest, in the knowledge that there is more to this story, and that it will still be waiting, unhurried, whenever you're ready to hear the rest of it. It is worth lingering too on the particular ritual of court presentation itself during this era. The careful choreography of introduction, the practiced walk across a throne room floor polished to a mirror shine, the specific angle at which a young noblewoman was taught to incline her head before a seated king. Every gesture had been rehearsed for weeks beforehand under the watchful correction of household tutors, and it is worth imagining the private exhaustion of performing perfection so completely, only to have the entire performance rendered irrelevant by a fear that had nothing to do with any gesture, correct or otherwise. Consider too the particular silence that must have filled the carriage ride home from that court. A father and daughter sitting across from one another, neither speaking, both privately recalculating an entire future that had, only hours earlier, seemed settled. It is worth sitting with the specific loneliness of that ride, the countryside rolling past the window unchanged and indifferent, while inside the carriage an entire imagined life, a silver-haired prince, a harp played somewhere in a garden, a marriage built on the girlhood conviction that beauty and birth might finally be enough, quietly dissolved into something that would need to be carried, unspoken, for years afterward. There is something worth sitting with too, in how differently this same rejection might have been received by a son rather than a daughter. A boy denied a particular marriage typically finding other avenues toward eventual standing and purpose still open to him, a sword to take up, a name to make through other means entirely. For her, this refusal represented something closer to the closing of the primary road available to her at all, since marriage remained, in the world she had been raised inside, very nearly the only mechanism by which a woman of her station could hope to shape her own eventual position in the world. It is worth sitting too, with the specific fact that no one in her household ever offered her any language for processing this particular disappointment. No ritual of comfort suited to a grief this abstract and this politically sensitive to even name aloud. Grief over a death, however painful, at least arrives with an entire social vocabulary built to accompany it. Mourning clothes, expected rites, a community that understands what has been lost and how to speak about it. Grief over a marriage that never happened has none of this scaffolding, and she was left, in the aftermath of that refusal, to invent her own private way of carrying it, entirely without guidance, entirely alone. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight, except the sound of my voice moving slowly through this next part of the story. Let your hands go loose again if they have tightened at all. Let the blankets settle around you, the way it settled around a young bride on the morning of her wedding, a morning that arrived not through the romance she'd imagined as a girl, but through the blunt machinery of war and its aftermath, when a rebellion had unseated a dynasty and left, in its place, a king who needed a queen and a house that needed to be reattached to power. The war that toppled the Dragon Kings ended with a stag ascending the throne, a man built like a mountain, loud in his laughter and louder in his grief, who had won his crown through battle rather than through bloodline, and who required in the aftermath exactly the kind of legitimacy that only marriage into an old and wealthy house could provide. Her father saw the opportunity the moment the war ended, and moved with the same cold precision he brought to every negotiation of his life, offering his daughter as the seal on an alliance that would bind the wealthiest family in the realm to the newly crowned king. She arrived at this marriage already carrying the private history of the prince who was never offered to her, and it is worth resting for a moment on what it must have felt like to walk toward a wedding that represented, in every practical sense, everything she had once wanted: a crown, a throne, the title of queen, while knowing, somewhere beneath the ceremony and the finery, that it had arrived through the wrong door, delivered by a war rather than by choice, worn for a man she had not selected, and who had not selected her either. Not truly, not in the way either of them might have selected a partner if the entire arrangement had not been built from the very beginning on the practical arithmetic of power. The king she married had, in fact, loved someone else first. A woman of ice and silver whose death during the very war that made him king had left a wound in him that never once closed, and it is worth sitting with the particular humiliation embedded in that fact. A new bride discovering often within the earliest days of a marriage meant to define the rest of her life, that her husband spoke another woman's name in his sleep, that he compared her, without meaning to, and often without even noticing he was doing it, against a memory that had calcified over the years into something no living woman could ever hope to compete against. We should sit with this rather than rushing past it, because grief and marriage rarely coexist gracefully, and a husband still mourning one woman while lying beside another creates a particular kind of loneliness in that second woman, a loneliness made worse rather than better by the fact that she was, by every visible measure, exactly what a queen was supposed to be: beautiful, capable, born to precisely the right family, and still somehow never enough to be truly seen by the one person whose gaze she had spent her entire early life being trained to attract and hold. The marriage, in the years that followed, settled into a pattern that repeated itself with the grim regularity of tide against rock. A husband who drank more each year than the year before, who found comfort in the beds of women who asked nothing complicated of him, who ruled his kingdom with the same careless energy he had once brought to battle, leaving the actual business of governing to advisers while he hunted and feasted and slowly let his own body grow soft and unrecognizable from the warrior he had once been. She, meanwhile, sat beside him at feasts and councils, smiling the particular smile that court life demands, learning in real time the difference between the throne she had once imagined and the throne she had actually been given. It is worth pausing here on the particular exhaustion of performing a role that offers none of the substance its title implies. She wore the crown. She sat at the king's right hand. She was addressed, in every formal setting, with the deference owed to the most powerful woman in the Seven Kingdoms. And yet the actual decisions of the realm, the wars fought, the taxes levied, the marriages arranged for lesser houses, moved through channels she had almost no genuine access to, filtered instead through her husband's small council, a body of men who tolerated her presence at their meetings, while making it privately and repeatedly clear that her opinions carried no real weight in the rooms where the kingdom's future was actually decided. There is a particular grief reserved for people who are given the appearance of power without its substance, and it is a grief that hardens differently than ordinary disappointment because it cannot be openly mourned. She could not complain of being unhappy as a queen, not publicly, not without appearing ungrateful for a position most women in her world would have given almost anything to hold, and so the resentment had nowhere to go except inward and downward, settling into the daily architecture of a marriage that both parties had long since stopped pretending was anything other than a political arrangement they were both, in their own ways, trapped inside. We should sit, too, with the specific violence that occasionally punctuated this arrangement, the moments when a husband's drunken temper turned physical, moments that the household around them learned to overlook or explain away, because a king's private conduct within his own marriage was, in that world, considered almost entirely beyond the reach of consequence. It is important in examining this part of the account to resist the urge to look away from what actually happened, and equally important to resist turning it into spectacle. It happened. It was wrong. It shaped her. And it is enough tonight to simply acknowledge that this was part of the cage, one more wall in a room she had not chosen to be locked inside. Consider, gently, what it does to a person's understanding of love and marriage to spend nearly 2 decades inside an arrangement built on mutual disappointment, where affection, when it appeared at all, arrived rarely and inconsistently, and where the primary shared project of the marriage became, increasingly, the maintenance of appearances rather than any genuine partnership. She learned, across those years, that a crown could be worn without ever once feeling like power, that a title could announce itself to the entire realm while the woman beneath it remained, in every meaningful sense, unheard in the rooms that mattered most. It bears sitting with the fact that her husband, for all his failures as a partner, was rarely deliberately cruel to her in the calculated way some of the story's other figures would prove to be. He was more often simply absent, present in body at the feast table, but absent in every way that might have made the marriage bearable, a man so consumed by his own private grief and his own private appetites that he had little left over to notice. The woman beside him was slowly and silently turning to iron in response to years of being unseen. It is worth pausing, too, on the particular loneliness of raising children inside a marriage like this one. Children who would come to matter to her more than almost anything else in her life, conceived under circumstances she rarely spoke of, and raised in a household where their father showed them the same distracted, occasional affection he showed everyone else, leaving her to become, in practice if not in official title, the only truly present parent in their lives, the only one whose love for them was neither performed nor divided among a dozen other appetites. Let us drift forward now, gently, toward the shape this marriage would eventually take in the memory of those who came after. Her children would grow up understanding their parents' marriage as a kind of weather they had simply always lived inside. Cold in some seasons and merely overcast in others, never quite warm. And centuries of listeners since have wondered, quietly, what might have become of her had that early betrothal to the Silver Prince been honoured instead, had she been given a marriage built on choice rather than political arithmetic, though it is, of course, impossible to know, and perhaps not even useful to wonder, since the woman shaped by disappointment is the only version of her the story ever actually gives us. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that so much of what the wider realm would eventually fear and despise in her, the coldness, the calculation, the refusal to ever again place her fate in a man's hands without a plan of her own running quietly underneath, took its shape inside this marriage, inside 2 decades of being crowned and unheard in the very same breath. A cage dressed as a crown is still, underneath the gold, a cage, and a person who spends long enough inside one learns, eventually, that the only real security lies in eventually holding the key themselves. Let your breathing settle now, slow and even, and let this chapter of the story rest where it belongs, in the past, already lived, already finished. There is nothing left to be done about any of it now. The marriage happened, the disappointment happened, and whatever came after, whatever hardness grew from these years of being crowned and yet unseen, grew slowly, the way all real transformations grow, one quiet, unremarked disappointment layered patiently on top of the last, until the whole shape of a different woman had formed without anyone, herself included, quite noticing the exact moment it happened. It is worth lingering too on the specific texture of the wedding itself, a ceremony of extraordinary wealth and spectacle, gold cloth and feasting that lasted long into the night. The entire capital turned out to watch a new queen ride through streets strewn with flower petals thrown by crowds who had no reason yet to feel anything toward her but hope. There is a particular sadness in imagining her riding through that adoring crowd, already carrying the quiet knowledge that the marriage beginning that day had not been built from anything resembling the destiny she had once believed was owed to her, performing joy for thousands of strangers while privately already grieving a future she had not yet been permitted to fully release. Consider too the specific loneliness of the early months of that marriage, before disappointment had fully calcified into the practiced distance that would eventually define it. A young queen still trying, in whatever small ways remained available to her, to build something workable out of the arrangement she'd been given. It is worth sitting with the effort embedded in this trying, the small gestures of accommodation, the private hope that familiarity might eventually produce something closer to warmth. Before that hope, too, joined the long list of things this account has already walked through being quietly and permanently disappointed. There is a particular detail worth pausing on in the accounts of this marriage, the fact that the two of them, for all their mutual unhappiness, occasionally found moments of genuine, if brief, understanding, shared grief over a difficult child, a private joke about the tedium of court ceremony, evidence that even a marriage built on such thoroughly mismatched foundations was not entirely without its small human moments of connection. It is worth sitting with this complexity rather than flattening the marriage into pure misery, because most real unhappiness, even profound and lasting unhappiness, still contains these small, contradictory pockets of ordinary human contact. It is worth sitting too with the way her husband's grief for the woman he had loved and lost before their marriage was never once hidden from her, spoken of openly at feasts, honoured in ways that made clear, without any cruelty necessarily intended, that this absent woman remained the true measure against which every subsequent affection in his life would always be judged and always found wanting. There is a particular loneliness in living permanently inside someone else's unfinished mourning, occupying a space that was never truly built for you, however capably you learn, over years to furnish it. Let your eyes stay closed, let the room around you fade a little further into softness, and let us turn now toward the one part of this story where love, whatever its flaws, was never in question. There is nothing frightening in what follows tonight, only tenderness twisted slowly by fear, which is, in the end, one of the saddest transformations a love can undergo. We are speaking now of children, 3 of them, gold-haired the way the old prophecy had promised, and of the particular, fierce, unrelenting devotion their mother carried for each of them across every year that followed their births. It is worth sitting first with the plain fact of it, that whatever else this woman became across the span of the story we are walking through tonight, however calculating or cold she appeared to those outside her closest circle, she loved her children with a completeness that never once wavered, a love utterly unlike the careful political affections that governed nearly every other relationship in her life. These 3 children were not alliances. They were not assets to be married off for advantage, not entirely. not in the way court logic might have dictated. They were, for her, the only unqualified good in a life otherwise built from compromise and disappointment. Consider what it might mean to a woman who had spent her entire adult life discovering, again and again, that her worth was measured by others according to standards she had no say in setting. To finally hold something entirely her own, something no council of men could take a vote on, something whose existence did not depend on a husband's fleeting attention or a father's grudging approval. Her children were hers in a way almost nothing else in her life had ever been permitted to be, and it is no great mystery, viewed this way, why she came to guard them with an intensity that bordered eventually on something closer to siege mentality than ordinary maternal care. We should pause here and sit with the particular fear that must have accompanied even the earliest days of that motherhood, a fear she likely could not have spoken aloud to anyone, not even to the brother who remained, throughout these years, the truest confidant of her life. The children she raised were not, in fact, born of the marriage the realm believed they belonged to, a secret so dangerous that its exposure would have meant not merely scandal, but almost certainly death for everyone involved, and it is worth imagining what it does to a mother's love to know, from the very moment of each child's birth, that the truth of their parentage was a blade permanently balanced above all their throats. This is worth sitting with, rather than hurrying past. The particular exhaustion of loving something you must also, every single day, actively hide. Every feast where her husband sat obliviously at the head of the table beside children who were not his own by blood. Every casual comment from a lord or a meester about which parent a child most resembled. Every moment where the truth sat close enough to the surface to be glimpsed by anyone paying careful attention, must have arrived to her as a small private terror, invisible to everyone around her, carried entirely alone. It is little wonder, viewed through this lens, that her devotion to these children curdled so often into something closer to control than to trust. A mother guarding a secret this dangerous does not have the luxury of simply loving her children the way other mothers might, with the relaxed confidence that comes from having nothing existential to hide. Every choice her children made, every friendship, every flicker of independence represented to her not merely the ordinary anxieties of parenthood, but a genuine and constant threat to their survival, and so she gripped tighter at every turn than a mother in a less precarious position would ever have needed to. Consider the eldest of the three, a boy whose cruelty would eventually become notorious across the realm, remembered by history as one of its most petty and vicious young rulers. It is worth sitting gently with the uncomfortable truth that his mother's love for him never once diminished despite his cruelty, that she defended him, excused him, and shielded him from consequence long after any objective observer would have recognized the danger he posed to everyone around him, including eventually to her. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The way love can persist stubbornly past the point where it stops being good for anyone, including the person it is directed toward. But it is an honest part of the account, and honesty is worth more here than comfort. We should consider, too, the particular helplessness she must have felt as that boy grew from a difficult child into a genuinely dangerous young king, wielding power without restraint the very moment it was placed in his hands, and how much of her own carefully built political position she was forced to spend, again and again, simply containing the damage of his impulses rather than advancing any agenda of her own. A mother who has spent her whole life fighting for scraps of real power finds herself, in this telling, forced to spend that power almost entirely on cleanup, on damage control, on quietly managing a son who could not be managed, and there is a particular grief embedded in that use of a hard-won resource, spent not on building anything new, but simply on preventing collapse. Her second child, a daughter, was sent away early to a foreign court as part of a marriage alliance, and it is worth pausing on the particular ache of that separation. A mother who had already lost so much control over so many aspects of her own life, watching her only daughter sail away to a country she had never seen, to a marriage negotiated entirely without the girl's consent, following exactly the same pattern that had shaped her own arranged marriage decades earlier. There is something almost unbearably circular in this detail. A woman who had suffered under the same system now watching her own daughter enter it, powerless to offer any alternative because no alternative in the world both of them had been born into actually existed. It is worth sitting with the letters she is said to have written to that daughter across the years of separation, letters that reportedly carried a warmth rarely visible in her public conduct, evidence that whatever hardness had grown around her by this point in her life, it had not grown all the way through. Distance in this account did not diminish the love. If anything, it sharpened it, turning ordinary maternal affection into something closer to grief carried at a low simmer across years and years of a daughter's absence. A grief made only worse when that daughter's own story ended, far too young, in circumstances entirely beyond her mother's ability to prevent or even properly mourn in public. The youngest child, gentle by temperament in a way that set him apart sharply from his older brother, represented perhaps her most complicated hope. A boy she seemed to believe, at least for a time, might grow into a kind of ruler the realm actually needed. Kind where his brother had been cruel, thoughtful where his brother had been reckless. It is worth sitting with the particular bitterness of watching that hope too slip steadily away from her control as the boy grew older and found, in his own marriage and his own advisors, sources of guidance that increasingly excluded her. A mother discovering that even her gentlest child could not be protected forever from simply growing up and choosing his own counsel. We should sit gently with the larger pattern this reveals about the particular shape of her love, a love so tightly wound around control that its own children eventually experienced it less as safety and more as siege, each of them, in their own way, straining against a mother whose fierce protection had curdled, through years of genuine external threat, into something that occasionally resembled possession more than care. This is not a judgment so much as an observation, the plain and sorrowful truth that fear, sustained long enough and intensely enough, reshapes even the purest love into something that can wound the very people it is meant to protect. Consider, too, the particular cruelty of the old prophecy resurfacing here. Its promise that all three golden children would wear crowns, and all three would also meet their ends in gold, a sentence she had carried since childhood, and which she now watched, with mounting and helpless horror, edge closer to fulfillment with every year that passed. It is worth imagining what it does to a mother to watch her children grow, always with that sentence murmuring somewhere in the back of her mind, unable to warn them plainly of a doom she herself barely believed, and yet could never quite dismiss. Let your breathing slow again, unhurried, and let this particular grief settle rather than sharpen. There is a tenderness buried inside everything we have walked through tonight, a mother's love, imperfect and often suffocating, but never once absent, never once withheld. It is worth remembering, as you drift further toward rest, that even the coldest figures in old stories carried warmth somewhere inside them, however distorted its expression eventually became, and that the particular tragedy of this woman's motherhood was never a lack of love, but rather love with nowhere safe to be placed, love that had to build its own fortress simply to survive in a world that offered her no other shelter. Let this chapter rest now, quietly, the way a mother finally sits down after a long day of watching over children who have, at last, fallen asleep themselves. There is more of this story still ahead of us, wars and betrayals and grief we have not yet touched, but none of it needs your attention tonight. Let the three golden children rest in your mind exactly as their mother most wanted to remember them, safe, together, still young enough to believe the world could be kept at bay by nothing more than a mother's determined will. It is worth lingering, too, on the particular sensory memory of early motherhood that surrounds this part of the account. The specific smell of a nursery kept warm against draughts, the particular sound of small feet on stone floors polished smooth by centuries of other small feet before them, the weight of a sleeping child settled against a shoulder in the hour before dawn, when the rest of the household still slept. Whatever this woman became by the end of this long account, it is worth sitting with the plain, unremarkable tenderness of these early years, ordinary in every way that mattered most, indistinguishable in these private hours from the motherhood of any woman in any household, anywhere in the realm. Consider, too, the particular vigilance required simply to keep the secret of her children's parentage across so many years. A vigilance that must have shaped even the smallest domestic decisions, which nursemaids could be trusted, which physicians consulted, which resemblances to comment on aloud, and which to quietly discourage others from noticing at all. It is worth sitting with the sheer cognitive weight of that sustained performance, maintained not for weeks or months but for the entire span of 3 childhoods, a secret carried every single day without a single day of rest from carrying it. There is something worth pausing on too, in the way her love for her children seemed to intensify rather than diminish in proportion to the danger surrounding them, a pattern common enough in parents facing genuine external threat, where tenderness and vigilance become nearly impossible to separate from one another. It is worth sitting with the recognition that this fusion of love and fear, so often judged harshly from the outside as smothering or excessive, may have simply been the only form love was permitted to take for a mother raising children whose very existence represented at every moment a mortal danger to everyone involved. It is worth sitting, too, with the particular way she is said to have handled the ordinary illnesses of childhood, the fevers and coughs that struck fear into any parent of that era, staying by a sickbed personally rather than delegating the task entirely to nursemaids, insisting on being told immediately of any change no matter the hour. It is worth pausing on this detail, small and easily overlooked amid the larger drama of the account, as evidence of a devotion that expressed itself most honestly not in grand gestures, but in these unglamorous, exhausting vigils that no one but the child themselves would ever remember or thank her for. Rest a little deeper now if you can, because the story is about to move into louder territory, though I promise to carry you through it slowly without urgency, the way a river carries a leaf through rapids, without ever once losing its own patient direction. We arrive now at the death of the husband whose crown had shadowed rather than shared with her for nearly 2 decades, an ending that came, in the end, not through poison or plot, but through the same reckless appetite that had defined so much of his reign, a wounded boar and too much wine on an ordinary hunting afternoon. There is something worth sitting with in the strange quiet of that moment, a queen standing over the deathbed of a husband she had never loved and had long since stopped pretending to, feeling, beneath the appropriate performance of grief that court life demanded of her, something closer to the first real freedom she had experienced since the day of her wedding. It is not a comfortable thing to imagine, relief arriving disguised as mourning, but it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, and this account has never been interested in comfortable dishonesty. Her eldest son ascended the throne within hours of his father's death, a boy of 13 already showing every sign of the cruelty that would come to define his short reign, and it is worth pausing here on the particular position she found herself in during those first weeks. Technically the most powerful woman in the realm, mother to the reigning king, and yet still surrounded by counsellors who had spent decades treating her opinions as decoration rather than substance. She had waited her whole life for a moment like this one, a throne finally within reach of her own influence, and she discovered almost immediately that even this moment came wrapped in familiar constraints. We should sit with the particular exhaustion of realizing that power, once finally gained, so rarely resembles the freedom it promised from a distance. She had imagined, across decades of being overlooked, that a throne held through her son would finally grant her the authority so long denied to her directly. Instead, she found herself locked in a constant grinding struggle against her own father, who arrived from the west not to support her, but to correct what he clearly viewed as her inadequate management of the realm, treating his own daughter with the same dismissive impatience he had shown her since childhood, as though nothing at all had changed in the intervening decades except the size of the throne room they now argued inside. It is worth pausing on this particular betrayal, because it may be the cruelest of all the disappointments this account has walked through so far. She had spent her entire life seeking her father's approval, absorbing his lessons, modelling her own ambitions on his example, And yet the moment she finally held genuine proximity to power, he arrived not to celebrate her achievement, but to take the reins from her hands as though she were still the child who had once watched her twin ride off to training grounds she was never permitted to enter. Even at the height of her formal authority, she remained, in her own father's eyes, an insufficient substitute for the son he had always wished could occupy her position instead. The war that erupted in the wake of the old king's death spread quickly across the continent, 5 separate claimants each declaring themselves the rightful ruler of the 7 kingdoms, and it is worth sitting for a moment on the sheer scale of what she found herself managing during these years. Armies moving across a map larger than most kingdoms elsewhere in the world, alliances shifting weekly, food growing scarce in a capital under near constant threat of siege, and at the centre of it all a queen regent forced to make decisions no one had ever trained her to make, learning statecraft in real time under conditions where a single miscalculation could mean the deaths of thousands. It is worth pausing too on the moments during this war where her instincts proved genuinely sound, where the political education she had absorbed sideways across decades of being excluded from formal councils revealed itself, under pressure, to be sharper than anyone around her had ever credited. She recognized threats that her advisors dismissed. She anticipated betrayals before they fully materialized. There is a particular satisfaction, sitting with this part of the account, in watching a woman finally given the chance to prove a competence she had been insisting on, quietly and mostly unheard, for her entire adult life. And yet even here, even in the moments of genuine skill, the credit rarely landed where it belonged. Victories achieved through her careful manoeuvring were attributed instead to the men nominally beneath her, to generals and advisers whose names history remembered more readily than hers, and it is worth sitting with the particular bitterness of that pattern, repeating itself yet again. Competence demonstrated and competence still somehow rendered invisible, as though the world had decided long before she ever proved anything, exactly how much credit a woman in her position was permitted to receive regardless of what she actually accomplished. We should consider, too, the specific horror of watching the war eventually reach the walls of the very city she was meant to be protecting. Ships burning on the water beneath wildfire she had authorized in a moment of desperate strategy. An entire invading fleet consumed in green flame while she stood, we are told, in a chamber above the chaos, calm in a way that unsettled even the men around her, having already resolved, in the event the city fell, to end things on her own terms rather than surrender to whatever violence awaited a captured queen. It is worth sitting with that resolve for a moment, not to glorify it, but to understand it. A woman who had spent her whole life watching control be taken from her, deciding in this one moment at least that the manner of her own ending would be hers alone to choose. The battle was won in the end by other hands and other timing than her own resolve, and the city held, and the war ground on toward its eventual exhausted conclusion. But something had shifted in her by the time the smoke cleared from the water. She had looked directly at the possibility of total loss, and had not flinched from it. And there is a particular hardening that occurs in a person who survives that kind of proximity to the absolute end of everything. A hardening that would only deepen across the years still to come, as though some inner door once opened by that fear never fully closed again afterward. It is worth sitting too with the particular loneliness of victory itself when it finally arrived, because there was no one left to properly share it with in the way she might once have imagined. Her husband was dead. Her father remained more rival than ally. Her son sat the throne but brought her no closer to real partnership in ruling it. Even her twin, present through much of the war, carried by this point his own private doubts about the path she had chosen, doubts he did not yet voice aloud but which sat between them, unspoken, changing the shape of the one relationship that had once felt entirely uncomplicated. We should sit with this pattern one more time before we move forward, because it is, by this point in the story, unmistakable. Every time this woman moved closer to the power she had wanted since childhood, the moment of arrival revealed itself to be smaller and lonelier than the wanting had promised. This is not a fate unique to her, of course. Many lives are shaped by exactly this gap between the imagined destination and the actual arrival, but few lives illustrate it with the particular starkness that hers does. War after war, throne after throne, each victory arriving hollowed out by the very isolation required to win it. Let your breathing slow now, and let the smoke and fire of this chapter settle into stillness, the way a battlefield eventually goes quiet again long after the armies have marched away from it. There is grief in what we have walked through tonight. Grief for a woman who fought as hard as anyone in this account ever fought, and found, at the end of every fight, not the rest she had hoped for, but simply the next fight already gathering on the horizon. Let that grief rest gently in you for a moment. It does not require your action. It requires only your witnessing, and even that, tonight, can be soft. There is more of this story still ahead, a reckoning still to come that none of the players in this particular chapter could yet see approaching, but none of it needs to arrive in your mind tonight before you're ready for it. Let the war end here, in this room, in this quiet after the fire, and let yourself rest inside the simple fact that even the fiercest battles eventually go silent. Even the loudest chapters eventually give way to something gentler, if only because exhaustion, in the end, always arrives for everyone, kings and queens included. It is worth lingering too on the specific texture of a capital city under siege. The way ordinary sounds change entirely when a population understands that violence may arrive at any hour. Footsteps in the corridor outside a bedchamber taking on new weight. Distant noise from the street below, no longer safely dismissed as ordinary commerce. It is worth sitting with what it must have meant to manage a kingdom's defence while also managing the daily terror of a population, hungry and frightened, increasingly willing to blame their queen regent for every shortage and every rumour moving through the crowded streets below the keep. Consider too the particular burden of decisions made in these years that could never be undone. Orders given for supplies to be requisitioned from citizens already struggling. Sentences passed on traitors real and merely suspected. The entire machinery of wartime governance operating through her hands in ways that would have hardened even a far gentler temperament than the one she had already developed by this point in her life. It is worth sitting with the recognition that war rarely permits its administrators the luxury of choices that feel, in the moment or in hindsight, entirely clean. There is something worth pausing on too in the particular relationship this period built between her and the small trusted circle of advisors and guards who remained loyal to her personally rather than merely to her title, a loyalty earned, in some cases, through genuine respect for her capability under pressure. It is worth sitting with the fact that even in the loneliest chapters of this account, there remained a handful of people who chose of their own will to stand beside her, evidence that whatever hardness had grown in her by this point, something in her conduct during the war still proved capable of inspiring devotion rather than mere obedience. It bears sitting, too, with the specific grief of watching a father's respect never fully arrive despite every demonstrated competence, a grief that outlasted the war itself and would continue shaping her choices for the remainder of her life, a permanent ache for an approval that circumstance and temperament had conspired across her entire lifetime to keep just barely out of her reach. Let us sit, too, with the particular exhaustion of maintaining composure in front of a court that watched for any sign of weakness, the way hawks watch a field for movement, every meal taken in public scrutinized for what it might reveal, every private grief required to be folded away before it could ever reach her face in front of witnesses. It is worth imagining the sheer discipline required to sustain that composure across years rather than hours, a discipline that, once built, rarely allows itself to be set down again even when the immediate danger that necessitated it has finally passed. Consider too the specific weight of decisions made on behalf of a kingdom too large and too fractured for any single person to fully understand in its entirety. Edicts sent to distant provinces whose particular hardships she could only imagine rather than witness firsthand. Trusting reports that arrived weeks late and already shaped by whichever local lord had written them. It is worth sitting with the humility this ought to have demanded of any ruler in her position, and the particular tragedy of a system that so rarely permitted humility to survive contact with the practical demands of holding power at all. There is one more detail worth resting on before we move past this chapter: the particular way the smell of the wildfire lingered over the water for days after the battle ended. A green-tinged haze that fishermen and dock workers spoke of for years afterward. Evidence, long after the political consequences had been argued over and settled, that some things a city survives leave a residue that simply takes its own time to fade, indifferent entirely to how quickly the histories move on to their next chapter. Let your body settle a little heavier into whatever is holding it right now, the mattress, the cushions, the floor beneath the blanket, and let yourself understand that what comes next in this account is difficult, though it will be told gently, without lingering on the parts that do not need lingering on. We are speaking now of the lowest point in this woman's long fall, a humiliation so total and so public that it would come to define, in the minds of many who heard the story afterward, the entirety of who she was, though it was, in truth, only one chapter among many. In the years following the war, in her desperation to secure her position against rivals circling ever closer, she had made the mistake of empowering a religious faction within the capital, granting them military authority they had not held in generations, believing she could direct their zeal toward her own enemies without ever becoming a target of it herself. It is worth sitting with the particular irony of this miscalculation. A woman who had spent her whole life learning, the hard way, that power given to others is rarely returned intact, making exactly the same error herself, at exactly the moment she could least afford it. The faction she had armed turned, in time, not only against her enemies but against her, seizing on rumours and testimony regarding her own private conduct, accusations that reached into the most carefully guarded secrets of her life, and imprisoning her within the same religious compound she had once used to punish others. It is worth pausing on the particular vertigo of that reversal. A woman accustomed her entire life to being the one who decided who suffered consequence, finding herself instead confined to a cell, stripped of guards, stripped of comfort, entirely at the mercy of people who owed her nothing and feared her not at all. We should sit with the specific texture of that imprisonment rather than rushing past it. The cold stone, the meagre food, the total absence of the deference she had spent her entire life being surrounded by. There is a particular kind of suffering reserved for people who fall from very great heights, a suffering made sharper by memory, by the constant involuntary comparison between what a person once had and what has been left to them now. Every meal in that cell would have carried the ghost of feasts she had once presided over. Every cold night would have carried the memory of furs and fires she had once taken entirely for granted. Eventually, in exchange for a confession to lesser charges and a promise of eventual release, she was made to walk, alone, through the streets of the very city she had once ruled, stripped entirely of clothing, her hair shorn away, while a procession of religious figures behind her rang a bell and called out the word meant to mark her shame to every onlooker along the route. It is worth sitting, gently and without spectacle, on what this walk actually was. Not merely a physical ordeal, but a calculated theft of the one thing she had built her entire identity around since the earliest days of that prophecy in the wood, her beauty, her control over how the world was permitted to look at her. We should pause here and consider the particular cruelty of a punishment designed not simply to cause pain, but to strip away dignity itself, publicly and irreversibly, in front of the very people who had once looked up at her window with something approaching awe. Every jeer thrown at her during that walk, every piece of refuse hurled from a crowd that had, only years earlier, cheered her procession through those same streets as a new bride, represented a specific and deliberate reversal of every advantage she had ever held. She had spent her life believing that beauty and birth and gold could purchase permanent safety. This walk taught her, in the most brutal terms imaginable, that none of it had ever been permanent at all. It is worth sitting, too, with the account of her inner state during that walk. The way she's said to have focused, step by step, not on the crowd or the shame, but on survival itself, counting steps, imagining the walls of her childhood home, retreating inward into whatever private fortress the mind builds when the body is being subjected to something it cannot escape. There is a particular resilience in that survival strategy, even as there is horror in the fact that it was ever necessary. A woman finding in the depths of total public humiliation the same iron will that had carried her through every earlier disappointment in this account. We should sit gently with what this walk did to whatever remained soft in her by that point in her life. If the marriage had taught her that a crown could be worn without power, and the war had taught her that victory could arrive hollow and lonely, this walk taught her something even more total, that her own body, her own dignity could be taken from her entirely by people who had once feared her, in a single afternoon, in front of a crowd that had once adored her, and that no amount of gold or lineage had been sufficient to prevent it. It bears sitting with the particular resolve that formed in her in the immediate aftermath of that walk, a resolve that would go on to shape nearly everything she did in the time remaining to her, a decision, conscious and total, that she would never again allow herself to be placed in a position of such total vulnerability, that she would never again trust an institution or an alliance to protect her when it could just as easily turn and consume her instead. It is worth understanding this resolve not as villainy emerging from nowhere, but as the entirely comprehensible response of a person who had just been shown, in the most visceral terms imaginable, exactly how quickly the world could turn on her. Consider, too, the particular grief of walking that route past places that had once meant something gentler to her, past the steps of the great sept where she had once been married, past streets where her children had once ridden in procession, waving to crowds who cheered their names. Every landmark along that walk would have carried its own private echo of a better version of the life she had lived in that city, and it is worth sitting, for a moment, with the particular cruelty of grief and humiliation arriving together, inseparable, each sharpening the other. It is worth pausing too on what this ordeal reveals about the wider world this account has been walking through all along, a world where a woman's body remained, even at the height of her formal power, something that could be seized and displayed and punished by others in ways that would never have been inflicted on a man of equivalent rank. There is a pattern worth sitting with here, quietly, without needing to resolve it into any tidy lesson. The plain fact that every humiliation this woman endured across her life arrived through channels specifically available to a world that had never fully accepted her right to hold power in the first place. We should consider gently how this single afternoon would go on to harden into the final version of the woman the wider realm would come to fear. A woman who emerged from that walk having decided, with total and unshakable clarity, that she would rather burn everything around her than ever again stand exposed and powerless in front of a crowd that could turn against her without warning. Whatever came next in this account, whatever destruction followed, traces its clearest and most direct route back to this single walk through the streets of a city that had once loved her, and had, on this particular afternoon, shown her exactly how quickly that love could curdle into something closer to hatred. It is worth sitting, as we near the end of this chapter, with the simple, sorrowful truth that humiliation of this kind rarely produces humility in the way it is sometimes imagined to. More often, in this account and in countless others like it, it produces exactly the opposite, a hardening so total that mercy itself begins to feel, to the person who endured it, like a luxury they can no longer afford to extend to anyone else, including themselves. Let your breathing slow now, deliberately, and let this particular grief settle rather than sharpen inside you. There is no need to carry the image of that walk forward into your own rest tonight. Let it recede instead into the quiet distance of history, one more difficult chapter in a very long story, witnessed and understood rather than relived. The woman in this account survived that walk, whatever else it cost her, And survival, even bought at terrible cost, is still, in its own bruised way, a kind of continuation worth acknowledging before we let this chapter finally close. Rest now in the stillness after the crowd has gone home, after the bells have stopped ringing, after the streets have emptied back into ordinary evening quiet. The story will keep. There is more still to come, but none of it needs your attention in this moment. Only rest, only the slow settling of breath, only the quiet knowledge that even the darkest chapters of any life eventually give way to whatever comes next. It is worth lingering, too, on the specific conditions of her imprisonment leading up to the walk itself, the particular disorientation of losing track of days inside a cell with no window to mark the passing of light, the strange way time stretches and compresses in isolation until a single night can feel indistinguishable from an entire week. It is worth sitting with what this extended uncertainty must have done to her already, before the walk even began, wearing down whatever resistance she might otherwise have summoned against the ordeal still ahead of her. Consider, too, the particular cruelty of the confession she was made to give in exchange for the promise of eventual release, a confession to specific act she may or may not have actually committed, extracted under conditions that made any real distinction between truth and survival strategy essentially meaningless. It is worth sitting with the corrosive effect of being made to publicly affirm a version of events shaped entirely by her captor's interests rather than her own, a final theft layered on top of every other theft this chapter has already walked through, the theft of her own account of her own life. There is something worth pausing on too in the detail that a single loyal figure walked behind her during that procession, armoured and silent, present not to comfort her, but simply to ensure she survived the walk itself. It is worth sitting with the particular strangeness of that presence, protection offered without warmth, duty performed without tenderness, and yet still, in its own limited way, a single point of steadiness in an otherwise total absence of mercy, evidence that even in her lowest hour she had not been rendered entirely and completely alone. It is worth sitting too with the particular way physical pain settles into memory differently than emotional pain, lodging itself in the body in ways that resurface unexpectedly for years afterward. A cold morning, an unfamiliar bell, a crowd gathered too closely, any of these capable of returning her, instantly and without warning, to the particular sensations of that walk long after the wounds themselves had healed. It is worth sitting with the likelihood that she carried this walk with her, quite literally in her body for the rest of her life, regardless of how thoroughly she rebuilt her external position of power in its aftermath. Consider, too, the specific silence that greeted her return to the keep once the walk had finally ended. A household uncertain how to receive a queen who had just been so thoroughly and publicly humiliated. Servants and guards alike unsure whether kindness or careful distance was the safer response. It is worth sitting with the particular loneliness of arriving home from an ordeal like that one, to find even the people closest to her uncertain how to look at her. A final small isolation layered on top of everything else that Walk had already taken from her. Let your thoughts drift a little further now, unhurried, toward the part of this account where the woman we have been sitting with all evening finally, after everything, sat upon the throne itself, not beside a husband, not through the fragile proxy of a son too young or too indifferent to rule in his own right, but in her own name, alone, the first woman in centuries to hold that particular chair without a man's title standing between her and it. There is no need to hurry toward this moment. Let it arrive slowly, the way all long-delayed arrivals eventually do. By this point in the account, her second son too had died, following his brother into an early grave in circumstances that echoed the old prophecy with an exactness that must have felt to her less like coincidence and more like a slow and deliberate unspooling of a sentence spoken to her as a child in a hut that smelled of curdled milk. Only the youngest remained, gentle and increasingly withdrawn, a boy who had never wanted the crown in the first place, and who would soon choose, in the quietest and most devastating way imaginable. to leave this account entirely rather than continue living inside the machinery his mother had built around him. It is worth sitting with the particular horror of watching a prophecy fulfill itself, piece by piece across the years, each loss arriving with its own grief, and yet also with the terrible cumulative weight of confirmation, evidence stacking evidence, until the sentence spoken to a child in a wood had become, by this point in her life, something closer to a countdown than a curse. She had spent decades trying to outmaneuver those words, and it is worth pausing on the particular exhaustion of realizing gradually that outmaneuvering fate may never have been a possibility actually available to her at all. When she finally claimed the throne outright, following the destruction of the Great Sept and the death that followed from it, which we will sit with more fully in the chapter ahead, she did so not through the graceful accumulation of loyalty and respect that legitimate rulers typically require, but through raw, undisguised force, fear substituted openly for the affection she had never quite managed to earn from the people she ruled. It is worth considering what it means to finally win the exact prize you have wanted since childhood, and to win it in a manner that guarantees from the very first day that almost no one around you actually wants you to have it. We should sit with the particular loneliness of that throne room in the weeks after she finally sat in it. A woman who had spent her entire life believing that the chair itself was the destination, only to discover, once seated in it, that a throne won through terror rather than loyalty offers a strange and hollow kind of comfort, secure only for as long as the terror can be sustained, and increasingly exhausting to maintain with each passing week. Every advisor who bowed to her now did so with visible fear rather than respect, and it is worth pausing on how quickly fear, once it becomes the primary currency of a court, begins to erode the very stability it was meant to secure. It is worth pausing, too, on the particular irony of finally holding total, undivided authority over the Seven Kingdoms at the exact moment when the kingdoms themselves had begun fracturing beyond any single ruler's ability to hold together. Armies gathering in the north against a threat older than any human quarrel. Rival claimants sailing across the narrow sea with dragons at their command. The very foundations of the realm shifting beneath her, at the precise moment she had finally secured her place at its centre. There is a particular cruelty in that timing, a woman receiving the exact thing she had wanted for her entire life, only once the thing itself had become, through forces entirely outside her control, considerably less worth having. Consider, too, the particular isolation of ruling entirely alone by this point in the story. Without a husband, without a living son at her side, with her twin increasingly distant, disturbed by choices he could no longer fully condone, and with almost no one left in her innermost circle who loved her, rather than merely served her out of fear or ambition. She had spent her entire life believing that power, once fully secured, would finally bring her the safety and the recognition she had always been denied. Instead, she found herself, at the very summit of her ambition, more alone than she had been at any earlier point in this long account. We should sit with the specific psychology of a ruler who has learned, through decades of hard experience, that trust is a luxury she can no longer afford, and who therefore approaches every new relationship, every new alliance, with a suspicion so total that it forecloses almost automatically any possibility of the genuine loyalty she still, somewhere beneath all the armour, seemed to crave. It is worth considering how thoroughly this pattern had become self-perpetuating by this point in her life, each act of suspicion producing exactly the kind of distant, fearful court that then justified further suspicion, a closed loop with no apparent exit. It is worth pausing, too, on the particular defiance embedded in her insistence on ruling in her own name rather than through any male proxy, an insistence that, whatever else can be said about the methods she used to secure it, represented a genuine and radical break from the entire system that had denied her direct power since the day of her birth. She had watched every avenue toward legitimate authority closed to her, one by one across the decades, the crown she could not inherit, the regency that other men constantly undermined, and when she finally claimed the throne outright, she claimed it as herself, under her own family name, refusing even the traditional practice of ruling through the fiction of a husband's authority. We should sit with the specific weight of that refusal, because whatever moral judgment history eventually renders on the methods that got her there is something worth acknowledging in the sheer, stubborn insistence that a woman could sit that chair and be addressed by that title without a husband's name attached to hers. A small and costly victory purchased at the price of nearly everything else she once might have valued, but a victory nonetheless, and one that had never once, in all the centuries the Seven Kingdoms had existed, been claimed so directly by a woman before her. It bears sitting, too, with the particular grief embedded in this achievement, the fact that the very qualities required to seize and hold that throne under these circumstances, the ruthlessness, the suspicion, the willingness to burn bridges and sometimes buildings alongside them, were the very qualities that ensured she would never be permitted to enjoy the throne once she held it, ruling always from a posture of siege rather than security. A queen who had won the argument of her entire life and discovered too late that winning it had cost her almost everyone who might once have celebrated the victory alongside her. Let us sit for a moment with the strange mercy embedded in this particular tragedy. The fact that even now, even at what should have been the triumphant conclusion of a lifelong ambition, there remained inside her, by every account that survives her, a woman still capable of tenderness toward the very few people she still trusted, still capable of private fear, private doubt, private grief for a family that had been reduced piece by piece to almost nothing. The throne had not hardened her into something without feeling. It had only taught her with brutal consistency that feeling was a vulnerability she could no longer afford to display where anyone might see it. Let your breathing slow now, gently, and let this chapter settle the way dust settles over an empty throne room after the court has finally gone to bed. There is grief in this arrival, the particular grief of finally receiving what you always wanted, and discovering it arrived too late, too costly, too hollow to be the comfort it once promised from a distance. Let that grief rest quietly in you for a moment, without needing resolution, without needing a lesson drawn from it. Some griefs simply need witnessing, and this is one of them. There is one more chapter still ahead in this account, the chapter of fire that finally consumed what remained of the sept and so much else besides, but it does not need to arrive in your mind tonight before you're ready. Let the throne room grow quiet in your imagination. Let the woman who finally sat in that chair rest there for a moment, alone but still breathing, still watching over a kingdom that no longer entirely recognized her as anything other than a woman to be feared. Let her rest, and let yourself rest alongside her, just a little longer, before we move toward what comes next. It is worth lingering, too, on the specific physical experience of sitting that particular chair for the first time in her own right. A throne forged from the swords of 1,000 defeated enemies, deliberately uncomfortable by design, a seat that punished any ruler foolish enough to grow too relaxed in claiming it. It is worth sitting with the symbolism embedded in that discomfort, a throne that offered no ease even to the person who had finally, after a lifetime of waiting, earned the unquestioned right to sit in it. Consider too the particular quiet of the small council chamber in the weeks following her ascension, a room that had once buzzed with the competing voices of men who dismissed her opinions, now silent and compliant in a way that should have felt like victory and instead felt, by most accounts, hollow and unnerving. Agreement offered too quickly to be trusted, compliance too total to be mistaken for genuine loyalty. There is something worth pausing on too in the reports of her private hours during this period, alone in chambers that had once been shared, however imperfectly, with a husband and later with growing children, now empty in a way that no amount of formal deference from courtiers could ever fill. It is worth sitting with the specific ache of achieving total authority inside rooms that had grown, through years of loss, entirely too large and too quiet for the woman now occupying them. It bears sitting, too, with the way she is said to have continued watching the northern horizon during these weeks, aware, even amid the demands of her own consolidation of power, that a threat older and colder than any human rival was moving steadily closer, a threat that made even her hard-won throne feel, in her more honest private moments, considerably smaller than it had once seemed from a great and hopeful distance. It is worth sitting, too, with the particular way her remaining advisers began during these final weeks of her reign, to speak to her with a careful, measured caution that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with fear of what might happen to anyone who displeased her. There is a specific loneliness embedded in watching an entire court learn to choose its words that carefully around you, every conversation slightly rehearsed, every disagreement filtered through so many layers of diplomatic softening that genuine counsel became almost impossible to receive even from the few people who might still have offered it honestly. Consider, too, the particular weight of ruling during a season when the ordinary machinery of a kingdom, harvests, trade routes, the slow accumulation of grain against a coming winter, continued regardless of the political drama consuming the capital. Distant farmers and merchants going about lives entirely untouched by the throne room intrigue that history would eventually remember most vividly. It is worth sitting with the strange humility embedded in that fact, a reminder that even the most consequential personal dramas in any single life eventually take their place inside a much larger and more indifferent unfolding of ordinary human continuance. Let your body sink a little deeper now, and let me tell you gently about fire, though not the ordinary kind that warms a hearth on a cold night. There is a substance in this account, ancient and unstable, kept beneath the city in vast stores by alchemists who understood only partially the forces they were guarding, a green and clinging flame capable of burning through stone and flesh alike, and it is this substance, more than any sword or army, that this woman would eventually turn to when every other avenue of control had finally closed around her. She faced, by this point in the story, a trial of her own, forced to answer publicly for accusations that reached into the very core of her private life, standing before the same religious authority that had already once stripped her of her dignity in the street, and it is worth sitting with the particular desperation of a person who has already survived one total humiliation, being made to face the possibility of a second, this time with consequences that might include not merely shame but death itself, delivered through trial by a champion she could not fully trust to fight fairly on her behalf. It is worth pausing here on the particular calculation that must have unfolded behind her eyes in the days leading up to that trial, a woman who had spent her entire life learning, through repeated and bitter experience, that institutions built to judge her were never institutions built to protect her, that mercy from tribunals and councils and religious courts had never once, across the whole span of this account, been extended to her in good faith. She had been failed by kings, by councils, by faith itself, and it is not difficult, sitting with this pattern now, to understand why she concluded finally that the only justice she could trust was justice she delivered herself. And so, on the morning appointed for that trial, while the city's great sept filled with the entire assembled leadership of the realm's religious and political life, gathered together in one building for what should have been a moment of reckoning for her alone, she instead set in motion a plan that had been prepared in total secrecy. Vast stores of the ancient green fire packed beneath the sept's foundations by loyal hands, wired through tunnels that had gone unnoticed by everyone who should have been guarding against exactly this possibility. We should sit for a moment with the sheer scale of what happened next, rather than rushing past it into judgment, because judgment will come easily enough on its own and does not need our help. The sept, one of the oldest and most sacred buildings in the entire city, erupted into flame so total and so sudden that nearly everyone inside it, the religious authority who had ordered her humiliation, the councillors who had opposed her at every turn, and countless others who had gathered that morning for reasons entirely separate from her own private war, were killed within moments, the building itself collapsing into rubble and green-tinged ash that would smoulder for days afterward. It is worth pausing here, gently but honestly, on the fact that among those killed in that fire was her own youngest child's wife, a young woman who had shown the gentle, withdrawn boy something closer to genuine partnership than either of his brothers had ever known in their own marriages, and it is worth sitting with the particular horror of a mother's desperate bid for her own survival, costing her son the one relationship that had finally seemed to be bringing him some measure of peace. This is not a detail that can be softened or explained away, and this account has no interest in softening it. It happened, and it was a devastation that rippled outward from that morning for the rest of the story that followed. We should sit, too, with what this act reveals about the final shape her long transformation had taken by this point in the account. A woman who had once been a frightened child hearing a prophecy in a wood, who had once been a bride disappointed by a marriage she never wanted, who had once been a mother fiercely devoted to 3 children. She would go on to lose one by one, arriving finally at a point where the destruction of an entire building full of people, many of them entirely uninvolved in her personal grievances, had become, in her own calculation, an acceptable price for her own survival and her own final total consolidation of power. It is worth pausing on the particular loneliness required to reach that calculation, because cruelty on this scale does not emerge from a person who still feels fully connected to the ordinary web of human obligation and empathy that binds most lives together. By this point in the account, decades of betrayal, humiliation and loss had worn away enough of that web that she was able to look at the sept full of people, weigh the outcome against her own continued survival, and choose the fire without, by most accounts, any great hesitation. This is not a fact to be celebrated or excused. It is simply the terminal point of everything this account has walked through tonight, every disappointment compounding into the next, until empathy itself had become a luxury she apparently believed she could no longer afford. Consider, too, the particular symbolism embedded in the choice of the sept itself as the site of this destruction, the very heart of the faith that had once stripped her naked and marched her through the streets, reduced now to ash and rubble by her own hand. There is a grim and terrible completeness to that symmetry. The institution that had taken her dignity from her destroyed, in turn, by the very woman it had humiliated, though the price of that particular revenge was paid not by the architects of her humiliation alone, but by hundreds of others who happened to be standing beneath the same roof on the same morning. It is worth sitting, too, with the immediate aftermath of the fire, the way she is said to have watched it from a high window of the throne room, the green light reflecting off her face, calm in a way that unsettled even those who had grown accustomed to her particular brand of composure under pressure. There is something worth pausing on in that image, a woman finally exercising the kind of total, unanswerable power she had wanted her entire life, watching it manifest not as the graceful authority she might once have imagined as a girl in a wood, but as fire and screaming and the collapse of one of the oldest buildings in the city she had once been crowned to protect. We should sit gently with what happened to her remaining son in the days that followed, the gentle boy who had lost his wife in that fire, who understood, we are told, exactly what his mother had done and exactly why, and who found himself unable to continue living inside a family and a legacy built on this particular kind of foundation. His own ending, quiet and entirely without violence directed at anyone but himself, arrived not long after, the final and most devastating fulfillment of the old prophecy that had shadowed her entire life, all 3 golden children, in the end, meeting their end in circumstances his mother had never wanted for any of them, and yet had, in her own desperate bid for survival, played some direct part in bringing about. It is worth sitting with the specific and total collapse this represented, not of a kingdom, though the kingdom too was fracturing by this point, but of the one part of her life she had always insisted was untouchable, her love for her children, her fierce and lifelong determination to protect them from a world that had never once been fully willing to let her keep them safe. The fire that consumed the sept did not merely kill her enemies, it consumed, in its aftermath, the very thing she had spent her entire life fighting hardest to preserve, and it is worth pausing on the particular cruelty of a woman finally winning total power at the exact moment that power cost her everything power was ever supposed to protect. We should consider too how this act would come to define her in the memory of everyone who survived to tell the story afterward, transforming her, in the eyes of the wider realm, from a controversial and difficult queen into something closer to a monster, a transformation that erased, almost entirely, the decades of disappointment and constraint that had led her to this particular morning. It is worth sitting with the unfairness embedded in that erasure, not to excuse what she did, which cannot and should not be excused, but to understand that even monsters, in most true accounts, were rarely born as monsters. They were built, slowly, disappointment by disappointment, until the building was complete, and the person who emerged from it bore only a distant resemblance to the child who once stood frightened in a wood outside Casterly Rock. Let your breathing slow now, deliberately, and let the green fire finally burn itself out in your imagination, the way all fires eventually do, leaving behind only ash and the particular quiet that follows total destruction. There is grief in this chapter, more grief than in almost any other part of this account, and it is worth letting yourself feel the full weight of it before letting it go. Grief for the dead she never intended to kill, grief for the son she lost in its aftermath, grief for the woman she might have been had a single early prophecy never been spoken to a frightened child. Rest now in the stillness after the fire. There is only one chapter left in this long account, a closing meditation rather than another disaster, and it does not need to arrive in your mind yet. For now, simply let the ash settle, let the green light fade from the window, and let yourself drift a little closer to sleep, carrying nothing forward but the quiet, sorrowful understanding that even the most terrible endings usually began, a very long time before, as something considerably more innocent. It is worth lingering too on the specific engineering required to move so much volatile substance beneath a building, as heavily watched as the Great Sept without detection. Tunnels dug slowly over weeks by workers who understood only fragments of the larger plan. Wagons of ordinary seeming cargo passed through gates by guards who had no reason to suspect what they were actually escorting into the city's oldest sacred ground. It is worth sitting with the sheer patience required to execute a plan this total, a patience that reveals just how long she'd been quietly preparing. For a moment she may have suspected, on some level, would eventually arrive regardless of how the trial itself unfolded. Consider too the particular silence that must have filled her own private chambers in the hours before the fire, a woman alone with the full knowledge of what she was about to unleash, aware that there would be no possibility of retrieving the decision once it was set in motion. It is worth sitting with whatever passed through her in those final hours, whether regret or resolve, or simply the exhausted clarity of a person who has run out of every alternative and arrived at last at the one option she had spent her whole life hoping never to need. There is something worth pausing on too in the specific fact that she did not personally light the flame or stand anywhere near the sept when it finally erupted, choosing instead to watch from a distance, through a window, safe and untouched, while others carried out the actual mechanics of destruction on her behalf. It is worth sitting with what this particular detail reveals about the woman she had become by this point in the account, capable of ordering total devastation while remaining, in her own careful calculation, entirely separate from its physical execution. Consider too the particular way the green light of that fire was said to have been visible from nearly every corner of the city, reflected in windows blocks away from the sept itself, so that even those who had no part in the trial and no stake in her survival found themselves that morning staring up at a sky lit unnaturally bright, understanding only that something enormous and irreversible had just occurred, long before word of what exactly had happened began moving through the streets below. Let your body settle now, fully, into whatever is holding you, because we have reached at last the final room in the house we have been walking through together tonight. There is no more urgency required of you here, only a quiet gathering together of everything we have sat with, the prophecy, the mirror, the refused prince, the cage dressed as a crown, the children loved fiercely and lost one by one, the war, the walk, the throne, the fire. Let it all rest together now, side by side, the way old letters rest together in a drawer no one opens often anymore, each one still carrying its own particular weight. If you ask plainly what this woman actually wanted across the whole span of this long account, the answer, once you have sat with all of it, is simpler than the fire and the war and the scandal might suggest. She wanted to be seen as capable in her own right, not as an extension of a father's ambition, or a husband's crown, or a son's throne, but as herself, judged on her own merits, in a world that had decided long before she was ever given the chance to prove anything, exactly how much space a woman was permitted to occupy in the rooms where real decisions were made. Every choice that followed from that early denial, every alliance, every cruelty, every fire traces back to this one, almost unbearably ordinary wish to be taken seriously. It is worth pausing on how rarely this wish was ever actually granted to her cleanly, without cost, without qualification. When she proved capable during the war, credit moved quietly toward the men around her instead. When she finally claimed a throne in her own name, she found herself sitting it alone, feared rather than respected, secure only for as long as fear itself could be sustained. Even her love for her children, the one part of her life that asked nothing of the wider world's approval, was eventually twisted by the same forces that had shaped everything else, until protecting them required exactly the kind of ruthlessness that would go on to cost her their trust, their safety, and finally their lives. We should sit with the particular tragedy embedded in this pattern, not as an excuse for what she did, because excuse was never the purpose of tonight's account, but as an explanation, which is a different and gentler kind of understanding. A person denied legitimate power for long enough does not simply give up wanting it. She finds other roads toward it instead, roads that grow darker and more costly the longer the legitimate ones remain closed, until eventually the distinction between wanting power and needing power to merely survive collapses entirely, and every remaining choice looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from villainy, even when it began, a very long time earlier, as something closer to self-preservation. If you're drifting now, let yourself go a little further. There is nothing left in this account that requires your alertness. Before we finish, allow me to say only this. If this kind of story, patient and unhurried, is the kind that helps you rest, consider staying close for the next one, so that it is already waiting for you the next time your own mind needs somewhere quiet to go. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. Consider for a moment the wider echo this particular life sends forward through the rest of the story the realm would come to know, because she was never in the end the only woman denied a legitimate road toward the power she was plainly capable of holding. Her own son's wife, a woman who had ruled a great and difficult city with genuine wisdom, would find her own competence dismissed and undermined by men who could not tolerate the sight of a queen, governing more effectively than they believed a woman should be permitted to. A young woman across the narrow sea would build an army and free thousands from bondage only to be told, again and again, by advisers and lovers alike, that her fitness to rule remained an open question no man of equivalent achievement would ever have needed to answer. It is worth sitting with this pattern rather than treating our subject tonight as an isolated case, because the entire world of this story, kind and cruel women alike, moved through the same narrow channel, permitted influence only at the pleasure of fathers, husbands, and sons, and punished in wildly different but equally instructive ways, whenever that influence grew large enough to threaten the men standing nominally above them. Sansa Stark, gentle and frightened as a girl, would spend years learning exactly this lesson at close range, watching what happened to women who asked too plainly for power, and would emerge from that education transformed into someone who understood, with a clarity our subject tonight arrived at only through decades of much harder losses, that survival for a woman in that world required patience, disguise, and the willingness to let cruder rivals destroy each other first, Consider too the particular way this account echoes forward into the life of Jon Snow, a man who never met her, and yet who would go on to inherit, in his own quieter way, the very same question that shaped her entire existence: whether legitimate right to rule could ever be separated from the raw, unaccountable exercise of power, and who would ultimately choose an answer she herself was never permitted to choose, walking away from a throne rather than seizing or defending it by force. It is worth sitting with the contrast between them, not as simple moral opposites, hero against villain, but as two people offered radically different sets of options by the same unequal world, one given every avenue toward legitimate authority and choosing, in the end to refuse it, the other denied every avenue and forced, across an entire lifetime, to build her own out of whatever materials remained available to her. There is a particular grief worth sitting with in that contrast. The recognition that a story so often remembered as a battle between good and evil was also, underneath everything else, a story about which people were permitted to fail safely, and which people were required to succeed perfectly, or else be destroyed for the attempt. She failed, in the end, catastrophically, and by her own hand in many ways, but it is worth asking gently how many of the men in this same account failed just as badly, started just as many wars, broke just as many promises, and were nonetheless remembered by history with considerably more sympathy than she has ever been extended. It is worth pausing too on her twin, the mirror who had walked beside her since the very first hour of both their lives, and on the particular tragedy of his own final choice, to finally step away from her at the very end, recognizing at last that whatever love still bound them together could not save either of them from the destruction her choices had set in motion. It is worth sitting with the sorrow embedded in that separation. Two people who had once needed nothing from the world except each other's presence, finally arriving after everything, at a point where even the oldest and deepest bond could no longer hold against the weight of what had been done and could not be undone. And it is worth sitting finally with her own ending when it came, not on a throne she had fought her entire life to hold, but beneath the very rock that had shaped her from childhood, its ancient stones finally giving way around her in the last collapse of everything she had spent decades trying to secure. There is a particular symmetry worth resting inside here. A woman who began this account as a frightened child inside a fortress of stone, and who ended it, decades later, buried beneath that same stone. The wood outside Casterly Rock, and the collapsing halls within it finally closing the same circle that had opened so long before, with a witch's whispered sentence to a child who only wanted to be told she was special. It is worth pausing one last time on the particular mercy of ending her mother's memory not in the fire and not beneath the rubble, but here instead, in the honest accounting we have built together tonight, a woman who wanted more than gold, more than a crown, more than any throne could ever actually provide, simply to matter in a world that had decided, before she ever had the chance to prove otherwise, exactly how much she was allowed to matter. She was never permitted to have that wish cleanly. But the wanting itself, ordinary and human, and shared by nearly everyone who has ever felt overlooked in a room built for someone else's ambition, deserves to be remembered honestly, without either excusing what it eventually became or erasing the understandable grief that gave it its first shape. Let your breathing slow now, all the way down, the pace of someone already halfway into sleep. There is nothing more to hold on to from tonight's account. Let the prophecy, the war, the fire, all of it settle into the same quiet stillness that eventually settles over every old story, however loudly it once burned. The history will keep. It has kept for a very long time already, and it will still be here, patient and unhurried, whenever you are ready to hear more of it. And now, if you have made it this far resting in the dark, let me leave you with the same quiet question I always like to ask. If you enjoyed this journey through her story tonight, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there as you drift off. And if there is another corner of this world, another lost queen or forgotten king, that you would like to fall asleep to next, leave it below, and let this simply be the last thought you carry with you. Warm and unhurried, as sleep finally, gently, takes the rest of you. Your watch for tonight has ended. Consider too, before we let this account close entirely, the particular way stories like this one tend to be remembered generations later, flattened over time into simpler shapes than the lives that produced them. A woman who once stood frightened in a wood outside a mountain fortress reduced in the retelling to a single word, cruel or ambitious or mad, when the actual shape of her life, as we have walked through it together tonight, resists any single word entirely. It is worth sitting with the responsibility this places on those of us still telling these stories centuries later, the responsibility to remember the whole shape of a life rather than only its most dramatic final chapter. It is worth pausing too on the particular kindness of allowing a difficult life its full complexity, rather than resolving it into something simpler and more comfortable to judge from a safe distance. She was not only the woman who set a sept ablaze, she was also the child who once believed, however briefly, that beauty and birth might be enough to secure a happy life. The mother who wrote tender letters across years of separation from a daughter she missed every single day. The sister who found in one particular mirror the only unconditional companionship her cold household ever offered her. All of this belonged to the same person, simultaneously without contradiction, the way most real lives actually work, however much simpler stories prefer their subjects to be only one thing at a time. Let this final thought settle over you now, gently, as we close. A child in a wood was told a story about her future, and she spent the whole of her life either fulfilling it or fighting it, never quite able to tell from the inside which of the two she was actually doing at any given moment. Perhaps that, more than any prophecy, is the truest thing this account has to offer you tonight. The recognition that so much of what shapes a life is decided long before we are old enough to consent to it, and that understanding this, gently and without judgment, may be the closest thing to peace any of us are ever actually given.